Good afternoon. Welcome to Kenya News Update today. I'm your host. In a move that would typically spark celebration across African capitals, the United States Congress has passed, and President Donald Trump has signed, legislation to revive and extend the African Growth and Opportunity Act, known as AGOA, for another year. This program, which grants eligible African nations tariff-free access to the vast U.S. market for thousands of products, has been a cornerstone of U.S.-Africa trade policy for nearly a quarter century. Yet, as we begin this deep dive, we find a surprising and complex reaction, particularly in one of the program's biggest beneficiaries, South Africa. The resuscitation of AGOA is getting few cheers in Pretoria. Why? What has changed in the geopolitical landscape since President Trump returned to the White House in January 2025? And what does this lukewarm reception tell us about the future of U.S.-Africa economic relations? Over the next 12 minutes, we'll unpack the numbers, the politics, and the profound sense of uncertainty now clouding what was once a celebrated partnership. Let's start with the basics of AGOA itself. Enacted in 2000 under President Bill Clinton, the African Growth and Opportunity Act was designed as a developmental tool. It aimed to stimulate economic growth across sub-Saharan Africa by providing duty-free treatment for exports to the United States. The logic was straightforward: open the world's largest consumer market to African goods, spur investment, create jobs, and foster sustainable development. For South Africa, it has been an undeniable success story. Key sectors flourished under its umbrella. The automotive industry, for instance, became a powerhouse exporter, shipping vehicles and components worth billions of dollars annually. The agricultural sector, particularly producers of citrus fruits, grapes, and wine, found a lucrative and stable market overseas. Over the past 25 years, AGOA has been more than a trade preference. For many South African businesses, it became a fundamental pillar of their export strategy and a reliable source of foreign exchange. However, the program has never been permanent. It requires periodic renewal by the U.S. Congress, and each renewal cycle brings with it a wave of anxiety for beneficiary countries. The latest expiration date loomed, and after months of debate, a one-year extension was passed. On the surface, this should be good news, a reprieve, a continuation of business as usual. But the context of this revival is everything. The world of 2026 is starkly different from the world of 2000 or even 2020. The geopolitical order is fragmenting. Great power competition, particularly between the United States and China, has become the dominant frame for international relations. And for Africa, this has meant being thrust onto a strategic chessboard where economic partnerships are increasingly viewed through a lens of security and ideological alignment. This is the new reality in which AGOA now operates. Now, let's examine the South African perspective, which is where our story finds its most poignant tension. When President Trump signed the AGOA extension this week, there were very few champagne corks popping in South Africa. Celebration was muted, replaced by a palpable sense of unease and strategic calculation. To understand why, we need to look at the recent history of U.S.-South Africa relations under the current American administration. Since President Trump's inauguration in January 2025, the bilateral relationship has been marked by significant friction. A major flashpoint was South Africa's case at the International Court of Justice against Israel, alleging genocide in Gaza. The U.S., a staunch ally of Israel, viewed South Africa's legal action with deep hostility. This diplomatic clash was not an isolated incident. It reflected a broader divergence in foreign policy outlooks and values. Furthermore, the Trump administration has consistently framed its foreign policy in transactional and security-first terms. Alliances and partnerships are weighed against a clear metric: are you with us or against us? In this binary worldview, South Africa's deepening ties with U.S. strategic rivals, namely China and Russia, have raised serious red flags in Washington. South Africa's participation in joint naval exercises with Russia and China, its continued membership in the BRICS bloc, which is seen as a counterweight to Western influence, and its generally non-aligned posture have all contributed to a growing perception in Washington that Pretoria is not a reliable partner. This perception directly impacts AGOA because AGOA eligibility is not automatic. Countries can be, and have been, removed from the program for failing to meet certain criteria, including not working to counter terrorism and not protecting worker rights. But more subjectively, the U.S. can act against countries deemed to be not supporting U.S. national security or foreign policy interests. This is where the statistics become crucial. Let's visualize the economic stakes for South Africa. While AGOA has been beneficial, its relative importance to the South African economy has evolved. At its peak, AGOA-driven exports were a more significant contributor to GDP growth. Today, while still vital for specific industries, the broader picture shows a shift. For example, South Africa's total trade with the United States as a percentage of its overall global trade has seen a notable decline. This is a key metric. Over the past decade, trade with the US as a share of South Africa's total trade has fallen significantly. Let's put a number on that shift. We estimate that US trade now constitutes approximately 15% of South Africa's total global trade volume, down from higher figures in the early 2000s. This 15% figure is critical context. It means that while the US market is important, South Africa has successfully diversified its trade relationships. Now, contrast that with trade growth elsewhere. South Africa's trade with China has expanded dramatically. China is now South Africa's largest trading partner overall. Trade with other BRICS nations, including India and Brazil, has also increased. This diversification is a deliberate strategy, born partly out of the inherent uncertainty of AGOA's renewal cycles. Relying on a trade preference that can be politically withdrawn creates vulnerability. So, South African businesses and the government have worked to build other markets. This strategic hedging explains part of the muted reaction. The loss of AGOA would be painful, particularly for the automotive and agricultural sectors we mentioned, but it would not be catastrophic for the entire economy in the way it might have been 15 years ago. The economic landscape has diversified, but let's not downplay the pain. For the sectors that do rely on AGOA, the threat is very real. The automotive industry is a prime example. It is a major employer and a hub of advanced manufacturing. A significant portion of its exports, we're talking about a figure in the range of 30% of its total vehicle exports by value, go to the United States under AGOA preferences. Losing that tariff-free access would make those cars and components more expensive, less competitive, and could lead to plant closures and job losses. That's a direct hit to a high-value industry. Similarly, for the agricultural sector, particularly the citrus industry, the U.S. is a critical market. Industry analysts suggest that up to 25% of South Africa's premium citrus exports are destined for the U.S., relying on AGOA to compete with producers from South America. For the wine industry, the figure might be slightly lower but still significant, with an estimated 3.5% of total export volume going to the U.S., though this represents a higher value segment. So, while the macroeconomic dependency has lessened, the microeconomic impact on specific, job-intensive industries would be severe. This brings us to the core of the debate. Is AGOA still a viable long-term strategy for South Africa, or is it a relic of a bygone era of U.S. foreign policy? We'll present two clear perspectives. First, the pragmatic pro-AGOA view. Proponents argue that despite the political headaches, the economic benefits are too concrete to walk away from. They point to the jobs created, the supply chains developed, and the export revenue generated. They argue that South Africa, with its high unemployment rate officially hovering around 33.5%, cannot afford to voluntarily surrender any job-creating mechanism. The view here is that diplomacy should be used to manage political differences, not trade policy. South Africa, they say, can maintain its independent foreign policy, its so-called non-aligned stance, while still engaging in mutually beneficial trade with the U.S. The goal should be to compartmentalize, keep trade and politics in separate boxes. From this perspective, the one-year extension, while short, is a victory that provides breathing room to lobby for a longer, more stable renewal in the future. Now, let's hear the counter-argument, the strategic skeptic's view. This perspective holds that AGOA has become a political weapon, not a development tool. Skeptics look at the one-year extension not as a gift, but as a warning shot. They see it as the shortest possible renewal, designed to keep South Africa on a very short leash. The message, they believe, is clear: fall in line with U.S. foreign policy objectives, or face expulsion next year. In this view, the dependency on AGOA creates a vulnerability that undermines South Africa's sovereign right to set its own foreign policy. Why should Pretoria's stance on Gaza, or its relationships with Beijing and Moscow, be held hostage by auto parts tariffs? This school of thought argues for accelerated diversification away from the U.S. market altogether. They point to the African Continental Free Trade Area as a more promising and more sovereign path to growth. They argue that betting on a fickle and politically conditional U.S. preference is a strategic mistake. The 26.5% year-on-year growth in trade with other African nations, for instance, is seen as a more sustainable and politically stable future. Adding another layer to this is the view from other African capitals. Kenya, for example, under President William Ruto, has pursued a notably closer strategic alignment with the United States. Kenya is a major beneficiary of AGOA, particularly in textiles and apparel. Nairobi's approach has been to embrace the partnership fully, positioning itself as a reliable anchor for U.S. interests in East Africa. This contrast is stark. While South Africa hedges and expresses skepticism, Kenya leans in. This divergence in strategy among Africa's economic powerhouses highlights a continent not speaking with one voice on how to engage with great powers. It also raises the question for Washington: does it reward unequivocal allies like Kenya with more than just AGOA, with deeper investment and security partnerships, while using AGOA as a stick to discipline more independent-minded partners like South Africa? So, what does the data tell us about the future? Let's look at investment flows, another key indicator. U.S. foreign direct investment in South Africa has been volatile. In recent years, there has been a noticeable caution among American investors, driven not only by South Africa's domestic challenges like energy insecurity, but also by the geopolitical friction we've discussed. Some estimates suggest that potential U.S. investment deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars have been put on hold or redirected due to the political climate. This is a hidden cost of the strained relationship. AGOA is about trade, but investment often follows trade. If the trade doorway seems unstable, the investment may not come through at all. This creates a compounding negative effect on growth and job creation. In conclusion, the revival of AGOA is a story with two very different interpretations. On one hand, it is the continuation of a valuable, job-creating trade program. On the other, it is a symbol of a strained relationship and a tool of geopolitical leverage. For South Africa, the lukewarm reception to the extension reflects a mature and difficult calculation. The country is weighing immediate economic benefits against long-term strategic autonomy. The one-year timeline is itself a source of instability, making it hard for businesses to plan. The era of taking AGOA for granted is over. The program now exists in the shadow of great power competition. For the United States, the challenge is whether it can maintain a trade for development program in Africa while simultaneously demanding foreign policy conformity. These two objectives may be increasingly incompatible. The muted cheers in South Africa are a warning siren. They signal that the foundational trust required for such a program is eroding. As Africa continues to assert its own agency on the world stage, the future of AGOA, and indeed all external partnership models, will depend on recognition of that agency, not conditional upon its surrender. The next 12 months will be a critical test for both Washington and Pretoria. Subscribe to Kenya News Update today.